Johnny Carson told everyone which 9 Golden Age guests were really bad guys. He brought America's biggest stars into living rooms across the country for 30 years. People who saw him laughed and smiled felt like they were watching old friends catch up over coffee. But Carson's smile often went away when the cameras stopped running and the viewers went home. People who were close to him say that America's favorite host kept a mental list of guests he thought were truly terrible people. A former Tonight Show director who worked with Carson for more than 10 years said that Johnny was the most professional person you could ever meet on camera. There were times, though, when he would turn to Ed and say, "That person should never be near a camera or a child." In his later years, Carson was more open about the famous people he had quietly disliked throughout his career. According to the stories he told his close friends, there were scary monsters behind the well-known faces of well-liked celebrities. Carson's revelations about a famous actress who seemed sweet and vulnerable on his couch but had screamed at a young production helper so badly behind the scenes that security had to step in were the most shocking. And the well-liked male star that Carson caught doing something so upsetting in his dressing room that the host almost called the cops. These weren't just tough people or stars who were picky. Carson said that these were really bad people who were hiding behind their fame and ability. They were predators, abusers, and manipulators, and the business protected them for decades. But first, we need to know why Carson really didn't like the first name on his list and why they had a private argument behind closed doors that no one has ever talked about until now. First, I'm nervous on stage, and I think everyone knows that. Second, I try to find a movie that has a lot of viewer identification. Janet Leigh, the Queen of Hollywood, had ice in her blood. In 1970, when Joan Crawford went on The Tonight Show, people saw the kind Hollywood star they had admired for decades. Crawford was the epitome of old Hollywood glitz with her perfect stance, flawless looks, and practiced charm. Several Tonight Show staff members said that Crawford was a very different person when she wasn't on TV. She was one of the most unfriendly people I've ever talked to. Years later, Carson is said to have told his author that talking to Crawford was like talking to a beautiful statue that didn't have any feelings inside. Crawford's looks started to cause problems before she even got to the studio. There were so many exact lighting needs in her list that the show's technical director still had the 4-page memo in his files decades later. A former director remembered that everything had to be exact. Everything about it was exactly 67 degrees, the tilt of her chair, the height of Johnny's desk, and even the temperature in the studio. Not 66 or 68. When Crawford finally got there 3 hours before the show started, she brought her own makeup artists, even though the show already had award-winning beauty artists on staff. What really showed who Crawford was, though, was how she treated people differently depending on how important they were to her. A stagehand who was there that day said she almost curtsied to Johnny. But when a young production helper accidentally walked into Crawford's dressing room with water she had asked for, she lost it. Several witnesses say that Crawford went on such a violent rant that employees in the hallway stood still in shock. She reportedly called the assistant, a 20-year-old woman who was new to the business, a brainless little tramp and told her to go work at a brothel, where being stupid might be a plus. The young woman ran away in tears, and Crawford told her she had to be fired. Carson's producer said no, which caused tension that lasted the whole show. What was most disturbing about Crawford's look, though, wasn't how she treated staff, it was how she changed when the cameras were on. She was just a machine that looked like a woman. Brought up. It was like she had practiced every answer and laugh. Every sudden moment, nothing was real. During commercial breaks, Crawford would quickly lose her smile and sit with her eyes closed, not talking to anyone. As soon as the red light came back on, she would smile again. Carson is known for making people feel at ease, but he had a hard time connecting with Crawford on a real level. He is said to have told Ed McMahon after the show, "I've talked to dead people with more personality." Years later, when Christina Crawford's autobiography Mommy Dearest said Joan was accused of abusing her adopted children, she wasn't shocked. Close friends say that all he did was nod and say, "I saw who she really was in those few hours. I believe everything." On the other hand, Carson was even more scared of his next enemy than Crawford's cold calculation. Raw power that is used to scare and threaten. That's easy for me to answer. I played Daphnis and Chloe during those lovely times. Carson couldn't stand Frank Sinatra, the nice mean guy. Frank Sinatra and Johnny Carson seemed to have a nice, even friendly, relationship on TV. The famous singer would laugh, tell stories, and sometimes sing, while Carson was the polite host. But behind the scenes, Carson was said to really hate Sinatra. Not because of how talented he was, because Carson admired that, but because of how the old blue eyes treated people when he thought no one important was looking. Besides singing, he'd be a police officer for the mob. Several accounts say that Carson told a friend that he was both, and sometimes I think he was both. Crew members knew that Sinatra's visits on The Tonight Show caused a lot of stress. Longtime staff said Sinatra would come with up to 8 men who didn't seem like they belonged in show business. They said they were more like guys you wouldn't want to meet in an alley. People from these groups would walk around the studio and watch the staff. One shooter said it felt like everyone was being watched. But what really upset Carson was seeing Sinatra treat people he thought were less important than him. A floor manager messed up during one show in the early 1970s when they forgot to give Sinatra the usual 3 minutes notice before his part. Several people who saw what happened say that Sinatra grabbed the man by the tie, pulled him close, and said, "Nobody tells me when I've got 3 minutes. When I'm ready, I'll speak." The person in charge of the floor, a man in his 50s who had served in the Korean War, looked very shaken afterward. Carson almost called off the show when he saw this conversation on his office monitor. The producer's mention of how well Sinatra would do in the ratings was the only thing that made him agree to keep going. Another thing that caused stress was Sinatra's dependability, or lack of it. He is said to have canceled last-minute appearances more than once, including one time when he was already in the building 2 hours before the tape but decided he wasn't in the mood. The most revealing moment happened during a commercial break, when Sinatra said something about the way a female staff member looked that was loud enough for people close to hear. He broke his normal professional silence and said, "Don't talk about my staff that way here." There was a lot of tension, and Sinatra looked shocked that anyone, even Johnny Carson, would question him. When the cameras came back, both men kept up their professional fronts, but Carson's questions got shorter and less interesting, according to the crew. Carson is said to have told his producer, "I don't care what his ratings are, limit him to once a year at most after that appearance." This is especially important because Carson almost never made decisions about bookings and almost never refused to let people stay. He limited Sinatra's performances, which said a lot about how much he didn't like the singer's behavior. While Sinatra showed the mean side of star power, Carson's next troublesome guest showed a different kind of toughness, an ego that didn't care about rules or boundaries. One argument against what I say is that the world is already full. Every single one of the best young directors is wet. You know, Orson Welles was a genius who didn't think rules were important. In the Carson era, Orson Welles went on The Tonight Show more than once, and his booming voice, larger-than-life presence, and amazing stories from his long career made each show unique. People watching at home saw a charming and clever storyteller. What Carson and his staff saw was different. Someone's ego had grown so big that he thought the normal rules of TV didn't apply to him. Carson is said to have said, "Never again," after a particularly tough Welles interview. That person still believes he is in charge of Rome. Most of the time, the trouble started before Welles got to the studio. Tonight Show writers say that Welles regularly turned down any prepared questions or topics that Carson's team had come up with. The things he told us to ask were: one previous writer remembered that it was dull and obvious. He crossed them all out and gave her a blank page back. Carson was put in the awkward situation of having to talk to one of the most important people in film history without any planning or structure. This was especially hard because Welles often went on long, winding stories that were hard to cut down for time. During one visit in the middle of the 1970s, Welles was set to have a 7-minute segment. He didn't move from the couch for almost 25 minutes, even though Carson gave him several subtle hints that the show was almost over. A director said that Johnny had a set of signs he would use to let people know when time was running out. "I talked to all of them and saw them all. We had to turn away 2 other guests." Welles treated his staff with the same level of disrespect. Reports say he wouldn't talk to the production helpers directly and instead talked about them in the third person, even though they were standing right next to him. "I need more water, tell her. Or have the boy change the light." People who knew Carson well say that Welles' habit of treating The Tonight Show like his own show instead of Carson's made him very angry. A former director said that Orson would bring props, change the subject at random, and even try to direct camera shots from his seat. At one point, he got up and tried to tell our camera operators what angles to use. Johnny was very angry. Carson is said to have told Ed McMahon, "Doesn't excuse everything," after a particularly difficult showing. You can't take over someone else's show just because you're smart. Carson, who is a perfectionist when it comes to making TV shows, thought Wells' lack of respect for the limitations of the medium was especially annoying. In public, he continued to admire Wells's huge contributions to film, but behind closed doors, he started to see him as an example of what can happen when ego gets in the way of ability. Wells showed how hard it can be to control a big personality. Carson's next tough guest brought a different issue. Which is made up of the most? Bette Davis was the queen of bad language in Hollywood. When the legendary actress Bette Davis went on The Tonight Show, she was at her most interesting. She told funny stories in her own unique style, and even in her later years, she looked beautiful. She also talked about interesting Hollywood history. They didn't see the times before and after the red light, when Davis apparently showed a rude side of himself that even Carson, who is usually calm, was shocked. Carson is said to have told Ed McMahon, "She doesn't need a stage, she needs a courtroom." After one especially tough showing. Bette Davis shouldn't be able to question someone without a lawyer present. Several Tonight Show staff members say Davis's first crime was how she treated other guests. Davis would often talk over or interrupt other celebrities on shows with more than one, especially if they were younger or women. In fact, she would turn her back on other people on the couch. A former talent coordinator said that when someone else told a funny story, she would get very angry and start planning how to get back in charge. The way Davis behaved behind the scenes was even worse. It was said that she asked for whiskey in her changing room before shows. Not unusual for guests of her time, but her drinking sometimes made her say and do things that weren't proper. Female staff members who worked on the show in the 1970s say Davis used racist and sexist words all the time, which was shocking even back then. One makeup artist said Davis turned her down and asked for someone whose hands don't shake like they've been drunk for 3 days. Carson. She usually didn't get into arguments, but she didn't mind Davis when she started yelling at a cue card holder for being too slow during a practice. A stage assistant who saw what happened said that Johnny actually stepped in. He told her in a quiet voice, "Ms. Davis, on this show, we treat everyone with respect or we don't talk at all." She was shocked and possibly wasn't used to being pushed, but she gave up. Carson had a hard time with Davis because of the difference between how talented she was and how she treated other people. Davis was a real legend whose work Carson respected, unlike some difficult guests who could be written off as lackluster. Carson is said to have told his director, "That's the last time," after her last show in the early 1980s. It's not worth the time to be verbally abused by Bette Davis. No matter how many Oscars she has. Davis at least aimed her insults at adults who could defend themselves. Carson's next troublesome guest, on the other hand, behaved inappropriately toward young women, which was a different kind of discomfort. Mickey Rooney, the old child star whose hands were all over the place. Mickey Rooney was a Hollywood legend. From 1939 to 1941, he was the biggest star in the movies and a live link to the golden age of the business. When he went on The Tonight Show, it should have been a happy look back at a great career. However, according to several staff members, Rooney's visits were known for his bad behavior, high energy, and sometimes being drunk. Carson is said to have told his director after one particularly bad show in the mid-1970s, he thinks being short gives him permission to be a pervert. Rooney, who was in his mid-50s at the time, got a bad name among female employees for touching them without permission, making sexual comments, and not respecting professional limits. Several sources say that when young production assistants found out that Rooney was hired, they would ask to be moved to another job. When you brought him water, he would grab your hand. "I want to pull you close." Someone who used to work as an assistant on the show in the late 1970s said, "Ask if you were married." He would hold on to your wrist for too long if you tried to leave. What was even scarier was that Rooney didn't seem to be able to tell when he had had too much to drink. Workers at The Tonight Show say he looked drunk on at least 3 occasions, stumbling over words and losing his train of thought in the middle of a statement. In 1977, during a famous episode, Rooney started telling a story about Judy Garland that quickly became inappropriate. Carson had to cut him off and change the subject. It was said that Carson asked his producer, "Is he drunk or is this just who he is now?" during the ad break. Carson had a hard time with Rooney because people from different generations had different ideas about what was acceptable behavior. Rooney was born in 1920, so she grew up in Hollywood during a time when some behaviors toward women were normal, if not okay. A director who worked on the show for many years said that Johnny wasn't rude, but he knew how to act professionally. When Rooney was told to behave better, he looked truly bewildered, as if he didn't know what the issue was. After one appearance where Rooney said several things about a young actress who was also on that night's show, Carson did something very unusual. He apologized to her in person after the tape. "I've never seen Johnny so embarrassed by a guest," the director said. He told her, "That's how professionals act on my show and it won't happen again." True to his word, Rooney's appearances became less frequent in the late 1970s and early 1980s, with Carson reportedly insisting on daytime pre-tapings rather than live evening broadcasts when Rooney was booked. While Rooney's behavior created uncomfortable situations, Carson's next challenging guest brought a different kind of difficulty, demands so extensive and unreasonable they became legendary among the staff. "I don't sing. My last marriage was one day and I didn't sing it. Lost it." Zsa Gabor, the diva who drove Carson to despair. With her glamorous appearance, distinctive accent, and flirtatious personality, Zsa Gabor was a Tonight Show favorite who appeared dozens of times during Carson's tenure. Viewers saw a charming, over-the-top personality who played up her Hungarian background in many marriages for laughs. Behind the scenes, according to numerous staff accounts, Gabor was one of the most demanding, difficult guests in the show's history. "I'd rather interview a cat," Carson reportedly quipped, after a particularly exhausting Gabor appearance. At least the cat wouldn't need 3 assistants and special lighting. Gabor's demands began long before she arrived at the studio. According to former Tonight Show employees, her standard requirements included a specific temperature in her dressing room, 74 degrees, fresh flowers, orchids only. No carnations. A bottle of Perrier water with exactly 3 ice cubes. Her own lighting technician flown in at the show's expense. No female guests who were younger than 40 booked on the same episode. Her writer read like a parody of celebrity demands. Recalled a former talent coordinator. "We thought it was a joke the first time we got it." When these requirements weren't met exact, Gabor reportedly would refuse to leave her dressing room until the situation was rectified, often delaying taping and throwing off the entire show's schedule. One of the most infamous incidents occurred when Gabor arrived for a taping and discovered the makeup department didn't have her preferred brand of foundation. According to multiple witnesses, she got into a shouting match with the head makeup artist, demanding someone be sent to Beverly Hills immediately to purchase the correct product. Johnny had to intervene, a former producer remembered. He called her directly and said something like, "Zaza, honey, you look beautiful already and we have a show to do. Let's save the cosmetics emergency for another day." What particularly irked Carson about Gabor's behavior was how it affected the overall production. Crew members would have to work extra hours, other guests would have to wait, and the show's carefully planned timeline would fall apart. Gabor was 40 minutes late for one appearance and then whined about how she was introduced. Carson is said to have told his executive producer, "The next time she wants to be on, tell her we've changed the name of the show to The Tonight Show, starring Zsa Gabor, and I'll be happy to be her sidekick." In spite of these problems, Gabor kept appearing on the show while Carson was in charge, which shows how entertaining she was when the cameras were rolling. Gabor's diva demands caused problems with scheduling, but Carson's next difficult guest caused a different kind of pain. Behavior that is hard to predict and could quickly turn a friendly conversation into a tense argument. The annoying mom. Shelley Winters, the powder keg who can change at any time. Shelley Winters won 2 Oscars and had a long career that spanned decades. When she was younger, she played flashy roles, but as she got older, she played more realistic roles. Having worked hard and done many things in Hollywood, she should have been a great guest on The Tonight Show. The truth is that people who worked on the show say Winters was one of Carson's most unreliable and volatile guests. Shelley doesn't say anything. She goes off. Carson is said to have said that after one especially tense appearance, Winters became known among the staff of the show for not being able to or ready to adjust to the light. This type of late-night TV is all about fun. Instead of telling funny stories or talking about new projects, she would often go on long political rants or deeply personal confessions that made Carson look uncomfortable. During one appearance in the mid-1970s, Winters started with a simple question about a new movie and quickly turned it into a 5-minute monologue about how corrupt the government was. Carson was left trying to find a way to switch the conversation to a lighter topic. A past director said that Johnny was great at controlling conversations, but it was impossible to do so with Shelley. He could only wait for her to tire out once she got going. Winter was unpredictable in more ways than just what she talked about. It became known that she would also lose her temper. She famously threw a whiskey glass in the face of another guest, Oliver Reed, on a British talk show after he said something racist. The staff at Tonight Show got worried whenever she was booked because of her reputation for being moody. Over would disappear for no reason before her parts. Even with these problems, Winters was different from some of Carson's other difficult guests because her behavior seemed to come from real passion instead of spite or ego. She was very interested in politics and society, and she saw every public appearance as a chance to talk about them. No matter how appropriate the setting was, Carson respected Winters' authenticity, even though she looked uncomfortable when she was feeling very emotional. After one particularly heated appearance in which she spoke out against the Vietnam War, Carson is said to have told his producer, Winters became less frequent in the later years of Carson's tenure. The host preferred guests whose conversational style complemented rather than challenged the show's format. Winters' passionate unpredictability caused problems on TV, but Carson's next difficult guest was someone he personally didn't like. Extreme political ideas that targeted groups that were already weak. Like a lot of muscles and red marks on the core. I like a pretty Jane Russell, the star Carson couldn't stand because of her politics. In the 1940s and 1950s, Jane Russell was one of Hollywood's most famous sex icons. She was in movies like The Outlaw and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. Because of her stunning good looks and important role in movie history, she seemed like a reasonable choice to be a regular guest on The Tonight Show. But after a few visits in the early 1970s, Russell rarely went back to Carson's couch. According to people who work on the show, Carson didn't like Russell's more extreme political views or how she was said to treat LGBTQ+ staff members. Carson was a moderate Republican for most of his life, but he made it a rule that The Tonight Show would stay mostly neutral on controversial political topics. Russell, on the other hand, is said to have used backroom conversations to share extreme conservative views that Carson found upsetting. Johnny was able to deal with people who had different political views. According to a former producer, what worried him was when those thoughts turned into attacks on other guests or staff members. Several sources say that Russell became famous for saying bad things about LGBTQ+ people who worked on the show. During an appearance in the early 1970s, she reportedly wouldn't let a gay makeup artist touch her face and asked for a different one. What worried Carson even more was a story about something that happened with Rock Hudson. A talent planner who worked on the show said Russell refused to be booked on the same episode as Hudson because he thought Hudson was gay, which was not known to the public at the time but was known in Hollywood. Johnny had a lot of gay friends, some of whom worked for the company. The talent coordinator said that when he said that kind of abuse would not be tolerated on his show, he was ahead of his time. Russell and Carson are said to have finally lost it when Russell made rude comments about civil rights laws during a commercial break during a 1973 show. Even though her words weren't picked up by the broadcast mics, other crew members heard them and they were said to have reached Carson. After that performance, Russell didn't show up as a guest on The Tonight Show for the rest of Carson's tenure. This is one of the few clear cases where Carson seems to have said no to future plans. This case stood out because Carson usually doesn't want to ban guests directly, especially ones with Russell's level of star power and historical importance to Hollywood. How strongly he felt about her behavior was clear from the way he took such a firm stand. Russell's politics and how he treated staff caused a permanent rift with Carson. But Russell's last and maybe strongest dislike was for a comedian whose public image and private behavior were said to be very different. I have never asked you this before, but I'm asking you now to please hold it. Carson, the comic, said that Jerry Lewis was really mean. Jerry Lewis was one of America's most famous and popular entertainers. He was a groundbreaking comedian, actor, director, and humanitarian, and his annual telethons raised money for research into muscular dystrophy. He was famous all over the world for his crazy energy and physical comedy. According to many staff members of The Tonight Show, Lewis was also one of the most difficult and degrading figures in Hollywood behind the scenes. Because of this, Carson personally blacklisted Lewis. He's what happens when ego gets in the way of ability. Carson allegedly told a coworker this after Lewis made an especially bad public appearance in the mid-1970s. Some difficult guests saved their worst behavior for subordinates, but Lewis apparently didn't hide the fact that he didn't like Carson. During one notorious appearance, Lewis talked over Carson, took over questions meant for other guests, and at one point reached over and adjusted Carson's tie without permission, which clearly irritated the usually calm host. "Rule," a former director said. "Johnny has to ask you to touch him first." Lewis was trying to show his strength, but he knew this and still did it. It is said that Lewis was even worse with his team members. Several people say that he wouldn't learn staff members' names and would instead call them "hey you" or by their job title, like camera guy, makeup artist, or girl. This happened no matter how experienced or senior they were. One particularly upsetting event was when a camera operator was said to have coughed quietly during Lewis's practice. Several people who were there say that Lewis stopped everything and went on a rant, yelling that the cameraman is a professional who breathes like a beginner and demands that he be kicked out of the studio. A boss on the floor who was there said that Jerry yelled at a camera operator for breathing loudly. He couldn't talk or breathe because he had allergies. Carson thought Lewis was most annoying because of the difference between how he behaved around people who couldn't help his job and how he behaved around children in public. A director who worked closely with Carson said that the Jekyll and Hyde routine made Johnny's skin crawl. "Watch Jerry cry on TV about how much he loves children, and then come on our show and treat people like they are beneath you." Carson is said to have told his executive producer, "Never again," after Lewis's last appearance on The Tonight Show in the early 1980s. Carson rarely actually told guests they couldn't be on the show, but Lewis joined a small group of famous people who were basically banned from it for the last 10 years. Years later, Carson was asked about Lewis at a private dinner, and what he said was so harsh that it shocked everyone there. "In a town full of fakes, he stands out as someone who is really mean. It takes work to do that." What Carson's blacklist shows about how Hollywood really is. Johnny Carson's private thoughts on these 9 difficult guests: Joan Crawford, Frank Sinatra, Orson Welles, Bette Davis, Mickey Rooney, Zsa Gabor, Shelley Winters, Jane Russell, and Jerry Lewis, show a rare, unfiltered look into the real life of Hollywood behind the well-kept front of glitz and charm. Johnny saw all of it. A producer of The Tonight Show for a long time said, "He was the only way for big stars to reach Americans for 30 years. He knew who was telling the truth and who was lying." It's especially helpful that Carson didn't have any reason to lie or make up bad stories in his judgments. Carson was at the very top of the entertainment business, not like tabloid reporters or unhappy workers with a grudge. He had nothing to gain by saying bad things about these famous people, and everything to lose if being honest hurt his chances of getting guests. His previous producer said that Johnny wasn't trying to make enemies. On the contrary, he wanted every conversation to go well. He didn't like someone because they made it hard for him not to. Carson's unique role as both a guardian and a confidant to the stars gave him a unique view of celebrity culture. For 30 years, stars showed sides of themselves on Carson's couch that they never showed anywhere else. This built trust, which made Carson's private opinions even more important. Carson's ability to tell the difference between people who were just annoying and those who were really a problem may be the most telling thing. He put up with oddities, nerves, and even a modest sense of self-importance. Being famous meant that you had to understand these things. Being mean, especially to people who were weak, was something he couldn't stand. His longtime boss remembered that Johnny had an easy test. How did they treat the helpers and pages? The guys who are running the cameras. That told him everything he needed to know about the person. Since Carson's death in 2005, many of his private thoughts have been confirmed by public information about these celebs. Several sources have confirmed what Christina Crawford said about her mother Joan, what others have said about Sinatra's ties to organized crime, and what others have said about Mickey Rooney's bad behavior. This shows Carson wasn't just being critical, he was pointing out real flaws in Holly's character that the publicity machine worked hard to hide from the public. The most shocking thing about Carson's blacklist is how well the studio system protected these stars, even though people in the business knew about their bad behavior. A long time ago, before social media and cancel culture, stars could keep up a perfect public image while acting horribly in private, knowing that studios, networks, and newspapers all wanted to keep them marketable. One cell phone movie today could ruin a career, said a writer for The Tonight Show. It was okay to throw a chair at an assistant back then, as long as they sold tickets. The story would never leave the building. When we feel nostalgic about Hollywood's golden age, Carson's honest reviews are a good way to remember that our culture icons have always had flaws. Behind their carefully crafted public personas, politicians are difficult people who can be inspiring, disappointing, or even deeply upsetting. He used to say that the camera didn't just add 10 pounds, it added a layer of fiction, which was something his longtime director remembered. He wasn't just good at talking to people, he was also great at seeing through their lies to the truth. Hi, thanks for watching this look at Johnny Carson's most tough guests. If this trip through the golden age of TV was interesting to you, please like it and subscribe for more in-depth looks into the past of entertainment. And if you thought what happened on Tonight Show shocked you, wait until you see our next video about the popular sitcom from the 1980s where cast members were quietly tormented by the child star whose cute on-screen antics hit violent outbursts so bad that producers put panic buttons in the set. If you don't want to miss this shocking Hollywood expose next week, click the bell button.